Hello everybody, so welcome back to another video about furniture from the past. What an unusual and outstanding piece from the 1790s. A semainier, named after the French word for the week, la semaine, with its 7 drawers, one for each day of the week. Now, taking a look at a work of decorative art like this should help show the difference between general antiques and the very small minority of them which are period pieces, art quality. So this is a piece from a fairly rare and short-lived style, the time of the French Revolution, known as the Directorate period in art history, when France was ruled not by a king, not by an emperor, but by a panel of 5 directors. Interesting governmental experiment. I'm not sure it solved things. Not that a change of heart would really be the answer. It's all about the perfect recipe of external conditions to impose upon ourselves. Anyway, the Directorate didn't last very long. As we all know, Napoleon came around shortly thereafter, and then the monarchy was restored after him. But anyway, the most famous piece of this variety is probably the secretary desk brought back to the United States in 1797 by then the future President James Monroe. We've mentioned that desk as well as several other pieces in this heavily brass-adorned Directorate period style in a number of other videos. So what on earth would you do with one of these semainiers? Well, I suppose you would have your servants arrange your undergarments or other foldable clothes in these drawers, one corresponding to the days of the week on which you were planning to wear them. Now, in general, the semainier is a fairly rare and unusual type of piece, and it is distinguished from the chiffonnier, which is a tall, narrow type of dresser, also for the bedroom, and that's a type of piece which emerged during the time of Louis XV. Now, they are generally smaller, and the semainier is simply one of those, but with much larger dimensions, and specifically with these 7 drawers. Now, the bottom drawer here is masquerading as 2 drawers, although it is only 1, so perhaps since this only has 6 drawers, it's just a large chiffonnier which appears to be a semainier, but which cannot be because it only has 6 drawers and not truly 7. But since the facade is designed to appear to have 7, I think we can call this a true semainier by virtue of its size and the appearance of the 7 drawers. But in any case, when you see a semainier, it will very unlikely be from this brief period in the mid-1790s when they made this brass-adorned style. And if you were to find one from this period, it probably wouldn't be quite as refined. There's really been an effort made to create a particularly beautiful semainier here in a style which is really known for its austerity, its simplicity, a lot of straight lines here, a certain sobriety. But before we get into the details, I would just like to point out how stylistically here we are between the earlier Louis XVI period's semainier. We can take a look at one here which sold at Christie's, and that one, also in mahogany, doesn't have any of this brass. It has some gilded bronze ornamentation, and we see that it has the exact same form, although it has a marble on top as opposed to a thinner white marble, which is actually enclosed by brass. That's quite a bit harder to make. So we are between that Louis XVI mahogany semainier and then the following Napoleonic Empire's semainier. We can take a look at one here, which is conserved by the French government in their National Furniture Reserve, also in mahogany, but quite a bit bolder. The neoclassicism is amplified, the architecture of the piece is more monolithic. So anyway, that helps us to understand this heavily brass-adorned Directorate furniture as a type of transitional moment between 2 much larger aesthetic movements in the history of the French decorative arts: the old regime's Louis XVI style and the early 19th century's Napoleonic Empire style. Now, the flutings here of these simulated columns, which have been adorned with brass, reveal the effort to move away from monochrome mahogany pieces which had been so in vogue for the previous 25 years. That's a useful comment that came from my friend and contractor, Paris court furniture expert Philippe Comminges, who I hire occasionally to examine pieces in person and to inject some of his expertise into these videos, and actually most of what I do. Much like I injected a little bit of protein-based glue behind some of these flutes to glue them back down. That's just part of the basic practices of caring for one of these pieces over the centuries. The flutes do tend to pop out every 50 years or so. This one's probably good for another 50. But anyway, the interest in contrast that we so clearly see with the addition of all of these brass ornaments continues even with the wood. There's been two species of mahogany used here, a lighter mahogany around each drawer, which creates a type of rhythm across the facade. We see that as well on the sides. The main panel shapes here are framed in a lighter mahogany. That framing is enhanced again by the brass fillets. Also the depth of the wood, as this is raised and this is recessed, and that contrast even continues down to this fine addition of an ebony inlay above and below these brass fillets. For those of us really down the furniture rabbit hole or the Directorate furniture rabbit hole, this is really nice to see. The ebony is perhaps the most refined aspect of this piece. It's extremely subtle, but it's something that you're really not going to see on Directorate period pieces, as if anyone really has a habit of seeing furniture exactly like this from 1795 on a regular basis. But if you did, you really wouldn't find very many examples of it which have the ebony inlays. It's part of why I think this piece is important to take a look at. So anyway, despite the simplicity, the sobriety of this piece, we see that there is a lot of movement going on. A real effort has been made to distinguish this from the previous Louis XVI period Semainier that we took a look at, very emblematic of a Semainier 10, 15 years earlier than this. But we see at the same time that the design of this Directorate piece really hasn't changed. They've changed the ornamentation, they've made an effort to differentiate it, but they haven't created a totally new style yet. Just to show you that Directorate furniture, although distinct, is considered, not just by virtue of how short the period is, but it's considered aesthetically to be transitional. We might as well just take a look at the dovetail work here, have a glance at this late 18th century joinery. We can see how some of the different woods have shrunk with different dilation coefficients as they react to climate fluctuations differently. Little separations have charmingly appeared upon close examination. And we can go ahead and look inside of the piece as well. It's pretty rough in there, typical of pre-industrial furniture. If you were to find, for instance, a later 19th century reinterpretation of this type of piece and not a true period one, you might expect the interior to be far cleaner. So in addition to looking at these dovetails, we can come around to the back of the piece, which is akin to looking at the back of a canvas, where on one end you have this wonderful work of art, and then on the other you say, my God, it's all a sham, it's all illusion, this is a cheap box. But that is the point, and I think it's important to start to conceptualize great works of furniture, works of decorative art from these early original periods as works of art, similar to a painting where you have all of this beauty, and then you come around the back and you say there's really quite an illusion going on here. We see that this is oxidized oak. There are some rudimentary elements true to this pre-industrial construction. We see that some slats have been slapped on here in an irregular way to cover up little separations between the panels or cracks which might have been there in the first place as they used sort of secondary wood to make these hidden parts of the piece. You might expect to see on the back of such a piece made 50 or 60 years later, as in fact there is a later reinterpretation of a Directorate period Semainier in the French Ministry of Culture's National Furniture Reserve. Well, you might expect on a piece like that for the back to be quite a bit smoother, a little bit more regular, and you certainly wouldn't find on that piece all of these sort of rustic irregularities that we're going to find inside of the piece, where it's fairly unsightly, in fact. But this is all part of helping people to see the difference between these earlier period pieces and then all of the copies or the reinterpretations that you'll find later, which make up the absolute majority of pieces you're ever going to encounter. But if you were to look inside of those, you really wouldn't see irregular pieces of wood full of knots. None of it seems to make any sense. Clearly they were just using cheaper pieces of wood in here, and they didn't go to any trouble to finish it. By the time the later 19th century comes around, and they were making copies or reinterpretations of these, you would see that the insides are far smoother, far more uniform than what we're going to find in here, because advancements in technology allowed them to make, or let's just say strictly functional parts of the piece. Well, they allowed them to standardize all of that and to make things smooth and beautiful without really much added effort. Now, there was a grand connoisseur who actually commented on the channel that the pieces I've been showing you are in fact all over the place in France. They're readily available. I'm sure he meant well to try to expose me for lying to all of you, but the fact is that although regular antiques are kind of everywhere, earlier pre-industrial publication or sometimes museum quality ones that we've been looking at for a number of years, those are not readily available, and they certainly are not akin to what you will find literally in drifts in French flea markets. The misinformation in his comment was matched only by his confidence in writing it, but he actually revealed not just how some of the nuances about great works versus regular works, how those nuances managed to evade his keen eye, but he really touched upon, accidentally, the entire point of these videos, which is to show people the differences between early great period pieces and then everything else. Those nuances, what appear as nuances, really become glaring differences with just a little bit of experience, especially to anybody who's seen all 100 or so videos. And I realize that this is an obscure subject and nobody really has time to go down the furniture history rabbit hole, but it is actually quite simple to know the difference between these art quality pieces, and it's really just a matter of seeing enough of them. I don't expect people to be an art expert, but with a basic orientation in furniture history and a little bit of exposure to great pieces, you will be exponentially better situated to make choices that you'll be proud of in the years to come. But we see that this is a white Carrara marble, and even though we really don't see it because it's too tall, we can assume that the fireplace in the bedroom where this was originally placed would have also been in white Carrara marble. Now, even though the Semainier was associated with the bedroom, by the 20th century, particularly beautiful Semainiers began to be placed in more versatile living spaces throughout the home simply because they're so interesting to look at. Perhaps the English language word for this, or if we wanted to go to more Anglophone furniture, we could look at a highboy dresser. So, finally, practical tips for moving your Directorate furniture from the 1790s. Always tape the feet when you're lifting these up. If you look very closely, this foot here has been replaced. It's different than the other three. I think if we look at the famous James Monroe secretary desk, again, we'll notice that it is actually missing some of its brass hooves. And I haven't had much furniture like this, but on every single one there has been at least one foot replaced. Thankfully, I've never had a foot missing. That would be very boring to have to go replace. But the point is, the wood has shrunk and these will sometimes fall out, so tape them up. And the other thing to be aware of is that over time, the underlying protein-based glue beneath these interesting brass flutes, well, it crystallizes, it expands, it gets a little globbed up with other layers of glue, which have been periodically necessary to keep these flutes in place, in addition to the nails that are often seen in the flutes. Someone nailed these down because they got tired of dealing with having to glue them back. But anyway, that glue sometimes expands and it causes this fluting to lift up. There isn't much of that going on here, but these are brass blades, so to speak, where they're lifting up, so you don't want to spend too much time, sliding your hand up and down any of the brass fluting to just see how long it will take to cut yourself. So, anyway, also take note of not using the locks on these old pieces as much as you might want to. It is very fun to turn the key and to fiddle with them. I do it all the time. Is this one? Well, I'll be damned. This one is not even working. This one will work. There we go. See, that one will work. But then when you try to close it, you gotta help it a little bit. And if that drawer was closed, well, you'd be cutting into the piece. And that's why you see these little defects around the keyhole entry plates where they've had to do a little surgery to open these up before. Now that's nothing bad. That's something we saw on a piece which was made for a Russian prince, which was purchased by the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art subsequently. So you'll see that on every other period piece. You'll see a little bit of fiddling discreetly around some of the keyholes, which seems to suggest that these old locks didn't really work that well even a long time ago. But it's especially true today that if you have some valuables that you need to lock up somewhere, It's probably best in the first place not to store them in anything quite so conspicuous as this. This just screams there's something great in there. But also the locks tend to lock shut and block the drawers if you use them. So try not to do that. Now that isn't true with huge pieces like armoires that have locks that are so large the metal is sort of akin to a type of gunsmithing. Those locks really work well. Secretary desks that have big locking mechanisms, they don't seem to get worn out. But these little drawer locks are infamous for blocking at the most inopportune times and then requiring that you sort of cut them open, and that's really quite a drag. Don't lose the brass feet, try not to get cut. Thank you very much to ESI Fine Art, or the Packingers. It's a great art shipping company which makes these crates and ensures that these interesting pieces arrive here safely. I guess we should thank the dinosaurs whose remains fueled the mighty ship that brought this over here across the Atlantic as well. And I will point out that my crates do cost more than most of these everyday antiques that certain nefarious people try to conflate with these beautiful pieces and leave mean comments. But do leave a comment if you'd like to, and please subscribe to the channel if you've found this information helpful. And finally, thank you to my customers who make everything I do here possible, and I'll see you all at the next video. Thank you.